winter solstice, but not happy first day of winter. That happened at the beginning of December. Some general information here. We're providing climate services to the central region. That happens between the state climatologists, between NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, National Weather Service, OAR and NIDIS, also the USDA Climate Hub. We have 2 regional climate centers that serve the region, the Midwest and High Plains, and also the National Drought Mitigation Center. Our next webinar is on January 18th in 2018. That sounds really far away. Our presenter is the Kentucky State Climatologist, Stu Foster. You can access webinars and information at the link that you see there, also at the MRCC and HPRCC websites. Our agenda for today is to go over our recent conditions. Yeah.
Hey, Becky, I'm going to back up one slide. There's something I wanted to mention in front of everybody here.
Yeah.
As of the end of today, I will be updating the webinar thing that I send out on a monthly basis to include the next 12 months. So if I do it correctly, you will not have to re-sign up again. If I don't do it correctly, I'm going to have to send out a new sign-in for a bunch of new webinars, and I don't really want to do that. I'm going to try to tack on the next 12 months onto this, so hopefully you won't have to do anything.
Okay, fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. So we're going to be going over some recent conditions, impacts from those conditions, and if you look at the picture at the right, you can see one of the impacts is an anomalously low pond, a lot of that going on in Missouri. And then we'll shift to outlooks, talk about the La Nina a little, and hopefully what we're seeing is a pattern shift in the short term. So here are our statewide November rankings. If you look at the map on the left, that is the temperature rankings. It goes from what would be the record coldest November, number 1, to the record warmest November at 123, because there's 123 years in the record. And you can see that the Four Corners states, including Colorado, recorded their warmest November in that 123-year record. That was primarily from minimum temperatures, which also show warmest record for those states. You can see that warmth spread out from that into the central region, the southern part, but we were much closer to average if you go into the northern part of the central region, up around North Dakota, and then your Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Great Lakes region. We're a bit closer to normal for temperature. Shifting over to the right, we're looking at the statewide precipitation ranks. This time the record driest will be in number 1, and the record wettest would be the 123. Our region is a bit interesting. As you can see, there's a mix, and that mix has a surprising La Nina-like pattern to it, where we see the wetter rankings up in the northern Rockies around Wyoming and Montana, and also around the Great Lakes region. And then we see drier as you go to the south and in the central part. And some notable ones are Missouri showing an 11 out of 123 years ranking. So it has been pretty darn dry in Missouri and very wet in Ohio. This is looking at the year-to-date ranking, so it takes into account all of January through November. So this is almost the entire year. I wouldn't expect to see too much big changes once we tack on the last month of the year. And what we see is very widespread warmth throughout the entire country. Some areas showing their warmest year-to-date on record, including New Mexico and Arizona, and also along the southeastern coastline. But throughout the central region, very warm, and overall pretty wet if we look at most of the central region, the exception being North Dakota, which did show some pretty severe drought conditions in the summer, Additionally, we saw that in Montana as well. If you look at Michigan, you'll see that it's had its record wettest year to date, and that's come down a little bit into the Ohio River Valley, Indiana and Ohio, both showing very wet year to date. So if you take the U.S., United States as a whole, that year to date is ranked as the 3rd warmest on the record and the 9th wettest on the record. So some pretty extreme values there, not close to average on either precip or temperature. Let's look at the last 30 days over the region. On the left, you can see the average temperature as a departure from the mean since November 21st. Those red colors that you're seeing are average temperature departures for an entire month that are almost 10 degrees or more above average. So we've seen a lot of warmth, especially in the northern part of the region where we really want to see some snow cover building up by now in North Dakota and Montana and down into South Dakota and Nebraska. We're not really seeing any cooler than average areas, although it is closer to average as you get closer to the Great Lakes in Michigan and Ohio. Precipitation on the right, this is the accumulated precipitation in inches. We've seen areas in our region that haven't had any precipitation in the past month, particularly in Kansas up into Nebraska. We've seen some pretty low values on the eastern plains of Colorado, throughout Missouri, Iowa, and southern Minnesota and into Illinois. One thing to note with this, though, is that even with the low precipitation we're seeing right now, and it is below average precipitation, this is generally a drier time of year for a lot of these locations. So when you get what seems like a big deficit in terms of percent of normal, it's not as big as you would think, and especially if you see above normal, that's not as significant as you would think as well, because there's just not that much precipitation to talk about this time of year. Now that's a different story when we go into the higher elevations, especially in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Those low values are not good because the bread and butter of precipitation for the Rocky Mountains is in the winter months. So that's not a good situation right now. In the Colorado Rocky Mountains, a little bit better as you go into western Wyoming and up into Montana. Speaking of snow, here's looking at the snow conditions. The NRCS's snow tell sites throughout the western United States. I'll focus talking about the interior Rockies along Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. And again, we see a little bit of that La Nina-like signature, although that may have just been coincidentally a La Nina pattern. It's hard to say, but we are seeing those higher snowpack values to the north and lower snowpack values to the south. So when we're looking in the Montana Rockies and western Wyoming Rockies, we are seeing values that are near the 100th percentile. They had a wonderful start to the snowpack season. There were some ski resorts in Wyoming that had over 100 inches of snow by the time their ski resorts were opening. A little bit different story in Colorado, not looking as good. Some of the northern mountains of Colorado, it's hard to tell, they're doing okay, but as you go further south, it's definitely not as pretty. So this is taking a basin average, and I'm only highlighting the watershed basins that are in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado to show that stark north-south difference that you see. And the one on the left shows what it looked like a month ago, and that really highlights the excellent start to the snowpack season that the northern Rockies were having. And things in Colorado were okay. It was kind of in that brownish transition zone, and then as you went south, it was not looking good. If you go to the map on the right and the most recent conditions, you'll see that even though snowpack looks decent to the north, it's not as great as it was, and that's because the entire region has really seen less of that from mid to late November and into December. So snowpack values across the board have gone down. It's just that there was a better start to the north to help boost those numbers now, even though there hasn't been as much snow as there should be. Here are a few time series of the snowpack accumulation compared to what we normally want to see. This is in the upper Missouri in Montana, and what we normally want to see is a red line, and the blue is what has happened this year. Both left and right, you'll see that it was very early on. We saw some excellent accumulations, and then as you look at early December, it started flatlining a little, particularly if you look above Fort Peck on the left side. You'll see that it was above average, and now that's lowered a little because it's just not maintaining that same steep accumulation curve that it needs. Better if you look at the Fort Peck to Garrison on the right side. And then if we move south to the Platte River Basin, we're looking at the North Platte on the left and the South Platte on the right. And what you see is they didn't have the huge jump in the early part of the season to jump above average. And then again, as you look in early December, you see a bit of a flat line. It's not following that steep sloped curve of the red line. So it's having a harder time staying near average as the season continues. So what we want to see is a quick jump back to that steep slope where we're having large accumulations throughout January and February. That will really be our make or break time in the mountains as to if we get enough snowpack to adequately feed the rivers and the reservoirs. So this is looking at modeled snowpack or snow cover across the entire central region. So it's not just your high elevation snow tell. This is looking over everywhere. And this was looking back at the beginning of December. Very little snow cover to talk about unless you were looking in the higher elevation mountains. And if we fast forward that to mid-December, we see a little bit more. That gray, though, is not very much. It's very minimal snowpack that we're starting to see in Wyoming, Colorado, and in the northern part of the region in North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I grabbed the map from this morning to show that we've already started a kickoff to this current snow event. So you'll see, I'll go back to to 2 weeks ago, or about 2 weeks ago, and then again here you'll see we've got all of Montana now covered and Wyoming covered, and a bit of an expansion of that snow cover, which we do want to see, especially with future extremes cold snaps that may be coming, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. Quick look at the soil moisture from a modeled product. This is an ensemble of many models showing percentile rankings of total column soil moisture. And what we really notice here is that stark dryness in the soil that pops out in Missouri and into Illinois. Very evident here that they're experiencing some extreme short-term dryness right now. But you do see that in those higher elevation northern Rockies, they indicate a lot wetter soils than normal. And I'm not sure if the models are smart enough to capture this, but I'm hoping that they're showing this, that they're showing accuracy based on the fact that warm temperatures have been melting some of that snow, and the soils just haven't been cold enough yet to keep that snow from running off, so it's just infiltrating into the soils, but I'm not sure. Here's looking at 28-day average stream flow over the entire country, and we see also some higher stream flows in those northern Rockies where there was excellent snowpack, but have also been seeing some warmer than average temperature that might be melting some of that snowpack. We're also seeing some high flows in the northern parts of the region in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then as you move south, they're getting a little bit lower, particularly if you look in Missouri and southern Illinois. I'm going to move on to impacts now and first show what our current drought depiction looks like. This is the latest drought monitor release. I thought it was, but now I'm looking and it looks like last week's. Sorry about that. I thought I had updated this, but this.
I'll pull up a new one at the end.
Okay, thank you. I thought I updated it. I think maybe I grabbed the new one, but you know how your computer caches old images. So based on last week, you can see that there is quite a bit of abnormally dry conditions, which is the yellow, throughout the central region. We're still seeing lingering drought conditions in Montana and bleeding into North Dakota and South Dakota, where those D2 and D3 colors are still showing up with severe and extreme drought. I think some of it was able to be chipped away at earlier in the season, but now we're in a time period where you're not going to see much drought relief because it's just a dry time period, so you're not going to get huge amounts to chip away at this. If we look at the change map, this is looking at the change in drought monitor depiction from November 21st to December 19th, which is this week's depiction. So I got that one updated. And what you see is that yellow color shows areas that saw a one-class degradation. So they could have gone from nothing to D0, or they could have gone from D0 to D1. And we see that over a very widespread region in the central region, throughout Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, little bits and pieces in other places. And we're not seeing that much improvement over the last month, maybe some minor improvements in Montana based on that excellent start to snowpack. But overall, we've just been seeing degradation. This is a quick look at what the Great Lakes levels look like. I've snapshotted a few years here so that you can see how the normal seasonal cycle plays out. And we're just now getting to returning down to lower levels in the winter time before they start increasing again in the spring. And overall, lake levels are doing what is expected to do. The little brown bars show the next 6 months forecast, but overall, nothing too concerning when looking at the Great Lakes levels. And then this is looking at the Great Lakes in terms of water temperature or ice cover. And I currently, yep, it says it right on the map, there's only 2.3% coverage. What this has meant is there is more opportunity for lake effect snow events because there's not the ice cover to kind of shut off that evaporation happening off the lake. So there's very minimal ice cover. The forecast is that there's not going to be much ice cover as we move through the winter. The forecast is for 26% peak ice cover as opposed to an average of 55% ice cover. And this could mean that the lake levels fall more than they normally do because usually when you freeze over, you also shut off that evaporation. When you don't shut that off, you might lose a little more to the atmosphere. And obviously, it could mean that areas could see more lake effect snow events if the conditions are right. Some agricultural impacts to talk about. In North Dakota, drought and snow moved in and delayed some of the harvesting, so some of the farmers there aren't going to be harvesting until next spring. This is, according to Dennis, fairly common. It sounds like it's kind of a test of when to do your harvest, and especially in those northern locations, that harvest just might have to be delayed once the snow comes in. Missouri, we've seen that dryness there. Very low stock ponds and lack of feed for livestock is a big issue. If we do get some cold season precipitation, that could help solve the low stock ponds, but there's still a lack of feed issue that could become an even bigger issue with extreme cold moving in, because you want to actually get that livestock more feed to help through that extreme cold. Indiana, one of the impacts was that wet conditions in the southern part of the state resulted in hay shortage because there was so much wetness it limited the cutting opportunities. Kansas also dealing with stock pond levels that are falling quickly, and apparently what prevents them from falling too much is icing over, but the warming temperatures have prevented that. Illinois, one of the impacts we've heard is that dry dew points have been dominating the region. That might change with the pattern shift, but they've been seeing some low relative humidities and low dew points recently, giving us the suggestion, is this a possible atmospheric drought? One of the positive impacts we're seeing from dry conditions in the region is that ranchers don't have to deal with mud as much, as that won't be an issue. And one final comment is that across the majority of the region, harvesting has been completed. Some regions just recently completing it in very early December. A couple of news stories of interest. This one's from Nebraska, where some farmers lost a lot of acres of corn. It was really due to a perfect storm of conditions. They had high heat during the pollination time periods that weakened the shanks, and a cool August actually resulted in bigger and heavier ears. And then finally, there was a couple of high wind events in late October, and it just ripped the corn right off those weakened stalks that had been weakened based on the previous ingredients that had occurred. So interesting how all different time periods led to this one event that has meant lots of loss of corn in Nebraska. North Dakota, the drought, big problem in the summer, and so there have been feed shortages for the ranchers, and this is a huge challenge for ranchers being able to keep their livestock well fed during the winter months. So there was this news story about the North Dakota Farmers Union making a lottery of donating bales of hay to ranchers in need. Finally in the news is the Legion Lake fire that occurred in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Showing a couple of recent tweets from Custer State Park on the left side announcing that the fire was 100% contained, and they have now opened the state park to visitors again on a limited basis. This is going to count as South Dakota's third largest fire in state history, and it's the largest fire to ever occur in December, so this is not something they normally see in December. One of the interesting points is that one of the days, sometime last week, the fire quickly grew from 4,000 acres to 47,000 acres in just a 24-hour period. And then it ended up maxing out over 50,000 acres. So thankfully, that is contained now. So some hydrology impacts we're seeing. The warmer temperatures recently have resulted in above normal flows. We showed that in the stream flow map, especially in the upper part of the Missouri Basin. Those warm temperatures have melted some of the snow that started accumulating, so we're getting above average flows, but we're not seeing lack of ice. We're not seeing ice formation issues, lack of those issues. We do have significant cold weather coming, so ice formation is expected. Ice jamming along the rivers could become an issue. This is especially concerning near the Missouri headwaters, so something to keep a watch on. Overall, water is in good condition. Recent summer drought in the region was really in locations that aren't very big contributors to base flow. Now, this spring's flows and water supplies are going to be very sensitive to what happens and evolves with this winter's snowpack, so another thing to keep an eye on. So let's move forward and look at what's coming. Here is the 7-day QPF from the Weather Prediction Center across the region. So total accumulations we would expect to see over the next 7 days through December 28th. Not too shabby for the higher elevations. We're looking at what is actually considered about average precipitation for those higher elevations. We're a little bit, for a week, a little bit higher than average. We would actually want to see about an inch a week in some of those highest elevations, and we're seeing more than that, which is good. Throughout the lower elevation plains, expect to see generally under an inch, maybe closer to a quarter of an inch, which I would also say is pretty near average. Looks like some areas of Missouri and Illinois could get some bigger values, especially to the south, which could help some of the dry conditions there. This is from the National Digital Forecast Database from the National Weather Service, looking at the total new snow accumulations that will be forecasted through Saturday. And you can see those higher elevations getting a little bit more. And then as we move east, not huge, impressive amounts, more on the order of 1 to 2 inches. We do want to see this snowpack come in and help protect the ground a little bit more, insulate the ground from the deep freezes that we're expecting. And here's what the lows are going to look like for Christmas morning throughout the region. And this is going to be actually over several days of seeing very, very cold temperatures. The forecast on Christmas morning right now shows negative teens in North Dakota and Minnesota, down to single digits and around zero as you move further south, and then single digits to teens as we get down into Colorado and Kansas and Missouri. This is very cold. This could be hard on the ground for areas that are not being insulated by the snow. So hopefully what we're seeing in the northern part will help insulate a little, but it does look concerning for some of the winter wheat crops in Kansas and Colorado, where we're going to see that deep freeze event with little snow cover to help protect it. This is looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook. So from December 28th through January 3rd, you can see that that deep cold pattern stays in with us as there is high confidence of below average temperatures. So here's where I give my reminder that just because you see darker blues doesn't mean it'll be much colder than average. It just means there's more confidence, that more likelihood that there will be colder than average temperatures. Although I do think that in some of these areas we could see much colder than average temperatures anyway. So colder than average across the entire region, and it looks like wetter than average across most of the region, with the exception being around Lake Superior, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula. So hopefully this pans out and we do see above average precipitation, although it's really just a kind of slightly increased chance of above average precipitation. And another reminder to give that precipitation this time of year for the lower elevation plains is not really that much. So even if we get above average, it's really going to be hard to chip away at any dry conditions that we've been seeing over the past couple of months. Here's our 1 month outlook for January, and we see that there is an increased chance of below average temperatures across the northern part of the region and the Great Lakes, with equal chances across a lot of the rest of the region. And shifting over to the right and looking at precipitation, most of the region, there's too much uncertainty. We're seeing equal chances for below average, near average, or above average precipitation, with a slight increased chance of above average in the northern Rockies and maybe slightly into the Ohio River Valley there. Quick La Nina update. La Nina does continue And the blue bars show the probability of La Nina in each 3-month period. So we expect to see La Nina to continue through the spring. You still have that greater than 60% chance of La Nina in the February, March, April period, but dropping down to below that 50% chance in the March, April, May period. On the IRI website, it does say that it is the most likely scenario for Northern Hemisphere winter lasting into spring. That it's more of a weak La Nina, but not far from the threshold of moderate, is how they describe it. Here's the ENSO plume of models, of the statistical and dynamical models, all looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies. So in this -5 to -1 region is a weak La Nina, and then beyond the -1 would be that moderate La Nina. And if we look at the consensus, that pink, which is hard to see, but also the yellow too, it shows mostly in that weak La Nina category and slowly coming out of it as spring progresses. So here's the CPC's 3-month outlook for the January, February, March period, just released this morning, and it still follows that pretty typical La Nina pattern, although it has extended some of that dryness and warmth a little further north, but we still see that boundary with the wet and cool to the north, warm and dry to the south. And that's really always the case, is where is that boundary ultimately going to end up. But overall, we have seen consistency that there's an expectation of increased likelihood of above average precipitation in the northern Rockies, around the Four Corners, increased chances of below average precipitation, which would match what we've seen so far through the fall and into the early part of winter. Increased chance of above average temperatures in Colorado and slightly into Kansas, and then cooler in the northern part of our region and through the Great Lakes. And also want to mention that increased chance of above average precipitation throughout the Ohio River Valley and into the Great Lakes region, which has already been seeing a lot of precipitation in colder temperatures. The drought outlook for the same time period, the yellow is looking at areas where drought development is likely, and it's going to match pretty well with what we see in the CPC 3-month outlook, showing that those areas that are more likely to be drier than average, are more likely to also develop drought. So we're seeing that in the far southern reaches of our region, and they are showing it is possible to have some improvement in southern Missouri and also some improvement in Montana. So hopefully those pan out. Me personally, I might be a little more aggressive with this line of where drought development is possible. Probably, in my mind, it would actually extend a little bit further north than this, but we will see. Hopefully I'm wrong. So let's talk about some La Nina signatures. This is from the climate.gov's ENSO blog, and they talked about what does snow look like during a La Nina winter. And we see a pattern that we've mostly seen already, which is more snow than average in the northern Rockies and less snow than average as you move south. The only part we haven't really seen is, in particular here in Colorado, we had a start where it looked like we would be near average, but now it's drier than average. So that's not exactly panning out for us, unfortunately, in Colorado. But hopefully we see more of a La Nina-like pattern, bringing some more snow to the northern Rockies. It also shows more snow in Minnesota, Wisconsin, into the Great Lakes region. This is an interesting tool that I came across from the Earth Systems Research Laboratory in Boulder, where they've looked at risks, climate risks, and this one is specifically for La Nina. So on the left, what we're looking at is the most interesting pattern I could find was if you look at the decreased risk. So it's kind of hard to describe. But what we're seeing is if you're looking at blue shading, there's a decreased risk of warm extremes. So we wouldn't expect to see a likelihood of very warm extremes in the Great Lakes region. And we wouldn't expect to see a lot of cold extremes in Kansas and Missouri during that January, February, March time period. On the right, we're looking at an increased risk for precipitation, and the reds and oranges and yellows show that there's an increased risk of dry extremes. So you definitely see that more to the south, but if you look at the Northern Rockies and Great Lakes region, you actually see an increased risk of wet extremes. So that's a fun one to play around with. Get a hold of that link and go visit it. So what will a La Nina actually mean for us? And take this all with a grain of salt because it's not a very strong La Nina, so other things could factor in to drive our weather patterns. Biggest question is that boundary between the north and the south. Where will that boundary line up? But we would expect we could see more snow and more precipitation to the north, less snow and less precipitation to the south. Poor snowpack conditions in Colorado would result in lower springtime flows on the North and South Platte headwaters and in the upper Arkansas River. But better snowpack conditions in Montana would benefit the headwaters of the Missouri River. Late season warmth that we've had combined with very little snow cover and then this transition to a sudden deep cold blast of air could be damaging to some of the winter crops that we have in our region. Again, it's hard to get drought relief in the winter since it's so dry in the lower elevation plains, but wet forecast, and I put wet because it's not really wet, it's just increased likelihood for above average precipitation, but it may help a little bit alleviate some of the drought stresses in the northern plains and Missouri. We'll have to wait and see on that. And drought is at risk of expanding in Colorado and Kansas. Here's some further information on our partners, the websites for the regional climate centers, where you can get the state of the climate reports from NOAA, the Climate Prediction Center, the climate and drought portals. You can look at the drought depiction at the drought.unl.edu. Yeah?
Yep. I'm sorry.
Okay, didn't know. Finally, thank you. I'll take questions. Any additional questions you have after this, you can direct to me. There's my email address and phone number. We also have Dennis Taddy and Doug Cluck's information there. Mike Timlin is the regional climatologist from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. Natalie is at the High Plains Regional Climate Center. And Brian Fuchs is at the Drought Mitigation Center and can answer drought questions.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
So before everybody leaves, I'd like to have just a quick chat. I don't have any questions queued up, but a quick chat about what this La Nina means and what the potentials are in terms of impacts or not. First of all, I think I was going to show you the let me see. I have to change presenter back to my screen here. Let's see if this works. Show my screen. Zap. All right. Does everybody see that? Is there a picture of the drought monitor up?
No. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's the current one. It probably hasn't changed dramatically from last week's, which she had in the presentation. A little more coverage of that D0 area, which is actually not. I'm hearing myself. Somebody's on. That must be you, Dennis. I can hear myself come back at me. come back at me. That D0 area isn't, the yellow area isn't officially drought area yet. It is abnormally dry and could be considered drought soon if it continues to be dry. One thing about any patterns that we see, or sort of looking back at past La Niñas and doing composites, which are very helpful, is that there has been a change over the years on how La Niñas have affected North America. And I think we talked a little bit about this last month for those who are on there. But it appears now as if since about, either the late 70s or early 80s, that there's been some sort of a shift in the way La Niñas are affecting North America in terms of the normal, if you will, their normal patterns. So what that really comes down to is, as I think Becky was saying, that line, that wet dry line usually falls somewhere in Colorado. Perhaps that has shifted slightly north. In terms of temperatures, again, we're not seeing the same cold temperatures from La Niñas that we had, say, prior to 1980, that we saw prior to 1980. Since then, and we haven't had a lot of these, so it's not like we have a lot of statistical skill in describing it, but generally speaking, we still get a few cold air outbreaks, but not as many as, and not as cold as, not as extreme as they used to be. That's all part of a global signal, not a huge surprise, I suppose. And so La Niñas have changed over the years. We can't necessarily compare a 1950 La Niña to a present day one. Also, as also Becky said, there's so many other things that can interrupt, especially a weak signal like we're having this year from La Niña, to kind of change things. So, for example, in 2011 we had a lot of flooding in the Upper Missouri River, and in 2012 we had the opposite. Both of those years were actually La Niña. There were some subtle differences, don't get me wrong, but overall they were considered either coming off of a La Niña year or in the middle of one. Okay. The other thing I wanted to tackle was, I don't know, Dennis, do you have any more to say about potential impacts, or Becky for that matter, to winter wheat, agricultural issues that you wanted to mention?
Certainly in the plains, there's concerns because winter wheat, especially in South Dakota, has taken a real beating already, and we're getting cold coming in, probably without too much snow cover. A few places will get a little bit of snow cover to help insulate against the cold, but it will probably do hit on winter wheat in that area. So that's the main one there.
Yeah, and soil temperatures have been somewhat above normal compared to what they should be this time of year. And if you look at the temperature map that Becky had up there,
I didn't have the soil temperature.
Yeah, that. But if you look at just the plain old temperature for the last 30 days or 90 days, you'll see it's been very warm, especially to the north and west, anomalously warm. We'll put it that way in those regions. So the cold, it will freeze eventually. It's just going to be later than normal this year, as far as soil.
Chunks of North Dakota soil is frozen already. With the cold coming over the next 1 to 2 weeks, that area of frozen soil will continue to head southward, and the depth of the frozen soil will continue to increase because, especially with very dry soils, the depth of the freezing will penetrate a little more quickly than it normally would.
We'll be doing this again next month and the month after that, et cetera. So you'll get updates, but there is quite a bit of concern in areas, let's say, from Nebraska south. I'll just say the whole High Plains are sort of concerned about their drought, right, and the conditions that they're currently in. It's going to be an interesting winter and early spring to see if and when precipitation materializes and how much. I don't want to be a doom and gloom kind of guy, and I don't want to sort of say anything that sort of interferes with what the Climate Prediction Center says. I don't want to contradict that, but it is a sort of a worrisome pattern that we've been in up to this point, and we've seen these dry and warm falls switch into or become dry springs and summers the next year, especially after a second La Nina. And this is 2 years in a row. We had La Nina last year, and now a relatively weak, but still La Nina again this year. So it'll be something that I'm sure the agricultural community and others will be watching closely.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to be doom and gloom either, but there have been a couple of scattered mentions in different regions of 2012. Just things looking like 2012. And I know that's something that we're certainly keeping an eye on here in Colorado. So it's not a guarantee, it's not a foregone conclusion, but definitely keep a watchful eye.
Yep. And look at that drought monitor every week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody have any other questions? I don't have any questions up from anyone on the phones or listening and watching. Anybody have any comments? Raise your hand or oh, here we go. Hold on. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah, just want to follow up on that last comment about it resembling 2012. What was 2012 like during this time of year and throughout the winter before the start of the growing season?
Dennis, do you want to start with that?
Actually, it was interesting because what 2011 was remembered for was the flood along the Missouri River, but and some wet conditions prior to that. Actually, as you get into the middle of 2011, it started to dry out by the middle of the growing season, and was a relatively dry winter overall. We started to have some hints overall that there were problems, and we didn't realize some of the depth of the issues because of the overall lack of soil moisture measurements we have around. Kind of missed as to what kind of soil moisture conditions we had going into 2012. So that's why we're watching soil moisture very carefully, because that is kind of a preset condition that if you have dry soils going into a growing season, you don't have some water in the bank, so to speak. So that's the reason for monitoring and watching very carefully, and with the potential for La Nina adding to some of that dryness in the southern parts of our region.
And I'll add to that the winter of 2011. Dennis, can you mute yourself real quick? Thanks. I think. Yep. And also in 2011, 2012 winter, we had remarkably, well, I call it extreme heat in March, sort of from the end of February through the 3rd or 4th week of March across the entire region. We had 80 plus degrees over a whole week during that period in some places, and a lot of things got growing, and so there was a lot more evaporation just from the heat. And then as plants began to grow and evapotranspirate, we lost more moisture that way. So those also helped, if you will, create the drought of 2012. So we'll have to, again, well, it's too early, as everybody's been saying, to peg this one next year or next spring to be a drought year or not in some parts. But it's certainly, those are the kind of things that we want to watch for. And you really don't need to tell a producer on the ground a lot of this stuff. But those of us who aren't always out there, experiencing it, these are the tools that we have to look for and patterns that we look at. Any other follow-up questions with that? Or comments anybody wants to make? Becky, I don't remember. You did show the yeah, you did show the Platte River. Okay, never mind. You did show the Platte River and the Missouri River's snowpack stuff from the core.
I can add in a soil temperature map for the one that gets.
Oh, the one that we publish. Okay. Yep. That's great. Sounds good. And I think that's about it. So I'll just say happy holidays to everybody. Unless I see I'm looking one more time. Happy holidays to everybody on the call, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing most or all of you next year. We'll be doing this 12 more months. So, and again, hopefully I can get this thing copied over so you don't have to do any work and you just get alerted as we go. If not, hopefully I'll be sending out an email to everyone, letting them know they need to sign up again. And if you have any issues with that, just email me and I'll fix it one way or the other. So thank you all. Have a great holidays. Relax, hopefully, and we'll see you in January. And thank you, Becky and Dennis.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.